It's not just that they were executed. It's not just that their order was dismantled. It's that they vanished utterly and without a trace from the very institution sworn to record everything. These weren't minor figures. These were grand preceptors, seneschals, regional masters. And yet, in the official archives of the Church, nothing. No trials, no confessions, no deaths, not even their names. It's as if they were never born, never served, never arrested. How do entire lives vanish from God's own paper trail? Let's take a breath, slow everything down. Because what follows isn't some fevered conspiracy, it's colder than that. A trail of paper ink and silence spanning continents and centuries. The Knights Templar warrior monks of the Crusades, guardians of Christendom's treasure routes and symbols of unshakable discipline. When King Philip IV of France ordered their sudden arrest in 1307, the Church hesitated, then followed suit. What began as a political grab soon became a purge. The order was dissolved. Assets were seized. Trials were held. Many were tortured. A few were burned. And yet, something doesn't sit right. In dusty archives across Europe, in Rome, in Avignon, and London, we find thousands of records. But not the ones we need most. Not the ones about them, the key leaders who were supposed to guide the order, defend it, or face the Inquisition with honor. They're not there. They're not anywhere. We know who should be listed. We have names from before the arrests. We know who ran the commanderies, who held the seals, who controlled the land. And still these men simply vanish the moment things turn dark. This isn't about hidden treasure or secret bloodlines. This is about something stranger. Quiet erasure. A cleansing not of flesh, but of memory. An institutional forgetting. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. You begin by picturing parchment, not the rolled scrolls of fairy tales, but heavy folios bound in cracked leather, inked with the slow, precise Latin of bureaucrats. These were the ledgers of Christendom, the archives of popes, bishops, priors, and abbots. And if a man led a commandery of the Knights Templar, his name should appear not once but dozens of times. He was a landholder, a military officer, a spiritual figure, a financier. Yet for a strange few, the record is as silent as a tomb that was never filled. By the year 1300, the Templars were divided into a clear and formal hierarchy, with regional leaders spread across Europe. Each province, France, England, Aragon, Portugal, Apulia, Hungary, had a master. Beneath them, preceptors ruled over regional districts, and below them, the commanders who held castles, priories, and manors. Each was entrusted with a seal, a personal sigil, or badge used to validate documents. These men signed property charters, rental agreements, tithes, exchanges of grain and horses. In doing so, they left behind a paper trail that modern historians can follow across decades. At least, they should have. Let's take just one example. The preceptor of Aquitaine, a vital Templar hub, with commanderies hugging trade routes from the Atlantic coast to the Pyrenees. We know from a few scattered receipts and mentions in third-party letters that a knight named Ponce d'Arzac held the title around 1305. Yet when the arrests began 2 years later, there is no mention of his interrogation. No inventory of his property, no record of his fate. His seal, once pressed into wax with authority, vanishes from every register. The same applies to men like Robert de Monclar, believed to have been the master of Provence. He had overseen Templar affairs stretching from Marseille to the foothills of the Alps. Records from the late 1290s show him negotiating with Cistercian abbots and receiving shipments of wool. Then, nothing. It's as if the century turned and the earth swallowed him whole. This isn't the silence of the forgotten poor. These men weren't anonymous. They were high-ranking, appointed, trusted. Their roles involved daily contact with local church officials and royal notaries. So why do so many vanish at the precise moment they should become most visible? Some scholars argue that these disappearances are illusions, gaps in an incomplete archive. After all, the survival of medieval documentation is a game of chance. Fires, wars, damp basements, and lazy scribes have consumed untold manuscripts, and yet other records from this same period of minor knights of cooks and stable boys of horses sold for barley remain. The clerical hand that copied those names somehow forgot the men at the top. This contradiction leads to uncomfortable questions. One theory suggests that certain leaders were deliberately excluded from the arrest warrants circulated by Philip IV. While the king famously had hundreds of knights arrested on October 13, 1307, not every Templar in France was captured. Some escaped. Others may never have been sought. If those men held crucial secrets or damning knowledge about church finances, royal debts, or papal negotiations, their sudden disappearance may have been encouraged. Of course, even if they'd fled or been spared, they should have reappeared eventually. Monasteries kept records of burials. Bishops tracked penitent knights. Even secular lords documented former Templars entering their service. But for the vanished leaders, not even that exists. No deaths, no retirements, no quiet lives on forgotten farms. And then there's the matter of the seals themselves. Seals were sacred. When a Templar died or was removed, his seal was supposed to be defaced, scored, or broken to prevent forgery. Sometimes the damaged seals were preserved with notations explaining the destruction. But for the missing leaders, we have neither the seals nor the notes. Their symbols simply cease to appear as if the wax itself decided not to speak. This absence is beginning to form a pattern, one that's hard to ignore. Why would the Church, so obsessed with records, with absolutions, with control, allow certain names to vanish without annotation? A quiet possibility emerges: these men were not forgotten. They were erased. Could it be that some high-ranking Templars knew too much, that they represented factions or loyalties inconvenient to either the French crown or the papal court? Or perhaps they opposed the trial proceedings and were quietly sidelined before they could speak? In the years following the arrests, papal envoys like Cardinal Berenger Fredol requested lists of Templar officials. They tried to reconstruct leadership chains. Some of those letters survive. In one, the cardinal laments the absence of proper names from Aquitaine-Languedoc and parts of Burgundy. He's not just puzzled, he's frustrated. And that brings us back to the question that opened this inquiry: not just who disappeared, but why their names were left out of the very machinery designed to remember. The men behind the seals held power, both practical and symbolic. Their disappearance wasn't just a clerical error. It was a warning, one written not in ink but in absence. The morning of Friday, October 13, 1307 was not cursed. It was calculated. Across the Kingdom of France, sealed orders were opened, simultaneously revealing King Philip IV's intent arrest every Knight Templar. The knights were caught unaware, roused from sleep, torn from prayers, or surrounded during morning chores. Royal officials, backed by soldiers and scribes, documented the arrests with almost fanatical precision. Names, titles, locations, all were recorded. Or rather, most were. These documents survive. Dozens of them. Some are complete lists of arrests in a city or region. Others are inventories of seized property. Taken together, they offer a remarkable snapshot of the Templar organization at the moment of collapse. But when historians overlay these lists onto known rosters of Templar command, something troubling emerges. Certain names expected to appear, leaders identified in records from just a year or two earlier, are missing entirely. It's like watching a play where half the cast exits stage left and is never seen again. One of the earliest known arrest records compiled by Guillaume de Nogaret's agents lists over 100 Templars seized in Paris alone. Yet several prominent figures based at the Paris Temple men who had recently signed charters or witnessed land grants do not appear. The same pattern repeats in Tours, Poitiers, and Avignon. Commanders who had notarized documents just months earlier are absent. It's as if they vanished a moment before the net was cast. Skeptics argue that some simply escaped. Perhaps they heard whispers, caught wind of the coming purge. Perhaps they fled south toward the Pyrenees or crossed the Channel to England. But even fugitives tend to leave shadows. Reports of pursuit, property left behind, disputes with locals. Yet the vanishing leaders leave behind none of that. In some regions, their estates are confiscated, but no owner is listed. No master, no steward, just empty commanderies. An even stranger twist lies in the cases where names do appear, but the titles are wrong. In Burgundy, an official record names Brother Etienne as acting commander, but no mention is made of the preceptor Jean de Brienne, who was documented in papal correspondence the year before. Why record the subordinate but not the superior? This suggests something far more deliberate than clerical error. In some areas, church authorities issued secondary arrest lists, hoping to complete the initial dragnet. These supplements are shorter, less formal, and often scribbled in the margins of other documents. A handful include vague references to missing brothers or speak of absent officers whose location is unknown. Still no names, no effort to pursue. An archival note in the register of the Bishop of Clermont reads, "The preceptory stands unclaimed. No brother of rank has presented himself." That's not an oversight, that's an acknowledgement. They were looking for someone, and he was gone. This raises a contentious question. Were some leaders shielded intentionally? The French crown had deep reasons to target the Templars. Debts owed power, resented whispers of secret rights. But within the church, attitudes were divided. Some bishops saw the Templars as holy warriors betrayed. Others believed the accusations of heresy and corruption. In this climate of confusion, it's not hard to imagine that sympathetic clerics or even high-ranking cardinals might have tipped off certain brothers. Moreover, the papacy was caught in a diplomatic tug-of-war. Pope Clement V initially opposed the arrests, then yielded under pressure. His vacillation created an opportunity in the window between rumor and order. Loyal insiders may have orchestrated quiet disappearances. Not in disguise, not under cover of darkness. Just a quiet nod to slip away before the ledgers were opened. These vanishing points begin to cluster. The same provinces that later showed gaps in trial records, the same ones where seals stopped appearing, are the places where arrest lists fail to match known leadership. The pattern is not random, it's regional, it's strategic. A controversial interpretation posits that some Templar leaders entered protected custody not to be punished, but to be silenced. Removed from circulation, held in private monastic houses, or perhaps even secluded in papal estates under a vow of absolute discretion. It sounds dramatic until one realizes how often the medieval church employed such tactics. Dissenting monks, political liabilities, and inconvenient witnesses were regularly shuffled into quiet corners of Christendom under the euphemism of retreat. Still, there's no definitive proof, just the growing unease of a puzzle missing the central pieces. The arrest lists were supposed to serve justice. They were tools of control, of accusation, of order. But they also tell us what someone wanted us to see. And perhaps more importantly, what they very much didn't. What begins to emerge is a vision of two Templar collapses. One, visible public trials, public burnings, public shame. And another, quieter, less theatrical, where key figures disappear, not because they were lost, but because someone made sure they wouldn't be found. You lean into the brittle crackle of parchment once more, the echo of a courtroom, not grand and echoing like in the movies, but cramped candlelit and damp. This is where justice unfolded in the early 14th century, in abbey chapter houses, drafty ecclesiastical chambers, the private halls of bishops and inquisitors. Over 4 years, hundreds of Templars were interrogated, tortured, and made to confess. The records from these proceedings still survive, but oddly persistently, they are riddled with absences. Not the accidental kind, the calculated kind. The trial transcripts, sometimes called the Templar dossiers, are among the most voluminous medieval legal archives ever created. France alone produced thousands of folios. They were copied, recopied, sent to Avignon, catalogued in Rome. These were not hasty notes, they were the foundation of a global scandal. But there are gaps, not in the sense of missing pages or torn parchment, in the sense that entire categories of expected entries don't exist. You notice it first in Normandy. The trial transcripts from Caen document interrogations of local knights in grisly bureaucratic detail, the sleep deprivation, the confessions under the lash, the repeating of prayers backward. But the regional master, Etienne de Vienne, never appears. His name had shown up on donation records just a year earlier. A man of stature, one who managed Templar properties near the coast and held significant influence over regional logistics. There is no record of his arrest, no statement, no outcome. Perhaps he died early before the Inquisition arrived. That would be the simplest explanation. But if so, why is there no death notice? No transfer of seal, no change in leadership. Templar rules were strict when a commander passed. His successor was appointed in writing. Yet in several regions, Normandy, Auvergne, Provence trial records begin abruptly, with second-tier officers with no reference to who had held command. In Languedoc, a pattern emerges that's even more peculiar. The court transcript mentions that the former preceptor could not be summoned. Not dead, not arrested, simply not summoned. The phrasing is vague, almost evasive. If it were about illness, they would have said so. If it were about death, the church would have documented it. But instead, silenced the bureaucratic shrug of a record keeper who had been told to move on. Some contemporary scholars believe this suggests a behind-the-scenes filtration process. That is, by the time the trials began in earnest, certain individuals had already been deemed inadmissible by forces higher than the local inquisitors. Whether protected by the papacy, removed by royal agents, or spirited away by fellow Templars, their absence was not an oversight. It was an instruction. Of course not. All of the trial records are complete today. The Avignon Registry, for instance, has missing volumes, some damaged by time, others potentially lost during the Napoleonic upheavals. But many of the gaps are not in the archives. They are within the documents themselves. Interrogation number 17 is followed by 18. But the name once associated with 17 has been scrubbed. You see the faint outline of erased ink, or worse, a complete omission with no heading at all. This raises the prickly issue of censorship. Medieval scribes were often instructed to correct politically inconvenient texts. A heretical statement might be struck through. A condemned name might be defaced. In some trial documents, one finds whole pages copied with blank sections, as if the clerks knew someone had once spoken, but were told not to record what was said. And then there's the sheer uniformity of some transcripts. In certain areas, all confessions follow the same format. Same heresies, same details, same tone. It's uncanny. You could change the names and barely notice. These were likely dictated under pressure, a template of guilt imposed from above. But for the missing leaders, there is no template, no record of guilt, no story at all. Was this a kindness, a cover-up, or simply the result of a secret deal? One possibility still debated in dusty academic circles is that the Church struck a bargain with certain Templar figures. In exchange for silence about finances, politics, or internal Templar secrets, they would not be tried, not killed, not even mentioned. A clerical witness writing in 1311 described a brother whose name I am not permitted to include. That's not just omission, that's suppression. You recall, too, that the Béranger Frédol inquiry mentioned earlier had trouble filling out the leadership rosters. His own trial summaries sometimes note no record found or identity uncertain. It's hard to accept this as incompetence. Frédol was thorough. His team was elite. If they couldn't find the names, perhaps they were looking in the wrong places, or perhaps someone had already made sure the names wouldn't be found. And let's not forget the papal bulls. Dozens of them were issued during the trial period outlining procedural rules for local inquisitions. Yet a few of these bulls were later recalled, reissued, or edited, often without explanation. A papal bull might refer to an earlier instruction now rendered obsolete by circumstances. No further detail. Just gone. So you're left with questions that feel more like accusations. Who had the authority to remove names from trial documents? Who stood to benefit from those men remaining nameless? And how do we trust the record if the record was built by those who needed certain truths to stay buried? In an age of parchment and ink, the empty space was never just an accident. It was a choice. The Vatican keeps secrets the way other institutions keep candles everywhere, flickering, layered in wax. Its registers, however, were never meant to be hidden. These were the lifeblood of ecclesiastical administration. Papal registers were meticulously maintained books of letters, decrees, appointments, pardons, and judgments. If a knight of the Temple was absolved, condemned, or even acknowledged during the years of the Templar crisis, his name should appear. Not just in passing, but underlined with papal weight. And yet here, too, silence spreads like ink, spilled and quickly blotted. Start with the obvious Pope Clement V, a complex man caught between loyalty to the French crown and the authority of St. Peter. During his papacy, the registers ballooned with correspondence related to the Templar affair. There are bulls of instruction orders for inquiry and records of communication with bishops and inquisitors. Whole folios are dedicated to the movement of property and reassignment of Templar lands. But the number of actual individuals mentioned by name, especially among the upper ranks, is shockingly small. We know, for instance, that the Pope issued directives regarding the Grand Master Jacques de Molay. His name is present, as are those of a few other high-profile figures. But beneath that thin layer of visibility, the expected flurry of correspondence involving regional leaders is conspicuously absent. Where is the record of Clement summoning the preceptor of Normandy? Where is the letter acknowledging the arrest of the master of Poitou? Even the Pope's scribes seem to dodge these entries. One explanation hinges on the clerical system itself. Papal letters were categorized by type letters of justice, of grace, of provision. If a knight was condemned, the record might be in one category. If he was forgiven, another. But search through each volume, even the lesser-used categories, and the same names remain missing. You find references to abbots and archdeacons, to wool merchants and stonemasons, but not to the Templar leaders whose sudden absence rippled across Europe. This has led to speculation that certain registers were altered or withheld. Not lost, withheld. In other words, they were deliberately filed in unindexed volumes or set aside for private circulation. The Vatican, after all, had multiple tiers of secrecy. There were letters shared with the College of Cardinals, and others locked in the Registrum Secretius, the private register. While some researchers have gained access to pieces of these documents, others remain off-limits, the official explanation being fragility or archival reorganization. It is worth noting that during this period, Pope Clement was operating from Avignon, not Rome. The so-called Avignon papacy was a relocation of the papal court, one that placed the Pope within reach of King Philip's influence. Some believe this proximity made it easier for the French crown to control or influence the handling of sensitive documents. One letter from Clement to a French bishop survives only in a copy. The original, if it ever existed, in the main registry, is gone. The copy mentions a brother commander of great influence now vanished without naming him. That phrase alone, now vanished, is unsettling. It implies knowledge, not absence through ignorance, but a deliberate withholding. Other historians point to the actions of the papal notaries. These men were responsible for physically transcribing papal decisions. Some notaries had strong ties to French factions. Others were aligned with the cardinals who opposed Philip's strong-arming. Depending on who recorded which letter and under whose supervision, entire entries could be shifted or omitted altogether. There is also a problem with cross-referencing. When a papal letter referred to prior correspondence, it often cited a volume and folio. But in the Templar affair, these internal references increasingly lead nowhere. A bull from 1310 might refer back to a 1308 instruction that when sought cannot be found. Perhaps it was lost, perhaps misfiled, or perhaps that instruction was never meant to survive a second reading. We return again to Cardinal Béranger Frédol, whose meticulous nature made him both valuable and dangerous. His letters describe frustration with the lack of clarity surrounding certain arrests. He writes of commanders unnamed in both French and Roman archives. That phrasing is deliberate, not unknown, but unnamed. The names were known. They were simply unwritten. And there's the rub. In the medieval church, to be unnamed was to be unreal. The sacred nature of record-keeping meant that identity and existence were bound together. To remove a name from a register was not merely to omit, it was to erase from the divine record the spiritual map. It was in a way to unperson someone before Orwell ever dreamed the word. We might laugh dryly at the idea of celestial bookkeeping, but to the men of the 14th century, to be erased from papal records was a sentence worse than excommunication. It was silence in eternity. So we ask again, who were the men deliberately kept off the page? And why was their fate decided not in fire, not in blood, but in ink that never touched the parchment? Somewhere deep in the Vatican's unlit corridors, their names may still exist, untouched, unspoken, waiting in the margins. Imagine a small village chapel in the year 1307. The wooden beams creak under the weight of the roof. Candles flicker near an altar of chipped stone. Just outside, a Templar commandery stands modest, fortified, disciplined. Its preceptor is a known figure in the community. He attends Mass. He donates grain. He occasionally lends horses to the bishop's envoys. And then one day, he is gone. But the parish records say nothing. The bishop's registers fall silent. No mention of his arrest, his confession, or his death. Just a name that once appeared regularly, now absent. As if someone quietly decided the pen would never write it again. Across Europe, diocesan archives, the ledgers kept by local churches and regional bishops, reflect this peculiar silence. In areas where Templar estates were prominent, we would expect a paper trail, ecclesiastical proceedings, burial permissions, reallocation of religious duties. Yet in dozens of towns, the clerical response to the order's collapse is strangely muted. In some places, it's as if the Templars never existed. Take, for example, the bishopric of Cahors in southern France. In the years prior to 1307, the diocesan records mention regular tithes from the nearby Templar preceptory. The bishop exchanged letters with its commander confirming donations and requesting provisions during times of famine. Then comes the year of the arrests. Other churches report seizures, sermons condemning heresy, even lists of Templar possessions to be redistributed. But Cahors, nothing. The records for that year contain weather notes, a few entries about livestock illness, and one small reference to a boundary dispute with a Cistercian abbey. No mention of the local Templars, not even in passing. One theory suggests that local bishops were caught off guard and simply didn't know how to respond. Perhaps they were waiting for papal instructions. Perhaps they considered it a matter for the crown, not the church. But this doesn't hold up under scrutiny. In regions like Champagne and Brittany, we find bishops responding swiftly sometimes, even before papal edicts arrived. They preached against the order. They redistributed Templar land. They held inquiry sessions. So why the silence elsewhere? In some cases, we find half-erased references suggesting that documents may have been edited after the fact. A particularly telling example comes from the Diocese of Rodez, where a ledger from 1308 contains a faint entry that appears to have originally included the phrase, Frater Hugo, former master of the house at Montsalvi. The phrase has been scraped away with a blade, leaving a visible scar in the parchment. The corrected version simply says property now under ecclesiastical review. No explanation. No accountability. This kind of deliberate omission opens the door to more troubling interpretations. Did certain bishops protect specific Templars? Were some allowed to flee or hide under the Church's protection? There are scattered records often dismissed by mainstream historians of monastic communities, quietly absorbing Templar fugitives. An anonymous chronicler in the Benedictine Abbey of Moissac wrote of strangers who came from the northern roads and took new names, devout but silent. It's vague, poetic, and lacking in names. But when read in context, it sounds less like wandering pilgrims and more like vanished knights. Not every silence was passive. In some dioceses, there are notes of open resistance to the king's commands. The Bishop of Uzès wrote privately that he would not sully the sanctity of his registry with forced accusations. His own records show only a single confiscation of land, not people. There's no record of any Templar being interrogated, detained, or condemned under his oversight. Even more puzzling are the areas where the land changed hands, but no human transaction was documented. A property might be reassigned to a Dominican convent or repurposed as a granary, yet there's no mention of how or when the Templar who lived there left. No formal expulsion, no note of his passing, just a date and a new owner. In church bureaucracy, silence is rarely innocent. Every deed, every tithe, every ecclesiastical dispute is typically recorded with care. To skip over the departure of a military religious leader, especially during a papally sanctioned purge, suggests complicity or fear. This brings us to a more controversial line of inquiry. Some believe that papal nuncios traveling under diplomatic protection may have instructed bishops to omit names for reasons of stability. This was an era when heresy trials could ignite revolts, when a town's faith in its bishop could collapse under rumors. To record the arrest of a beloved knight might provoke unrest. Easier to say nothing. To turn the page and begin again. But again, this explanation doesn't account for the consistency of these silences across such wide regions. It's not just one or two outliers. It's entire networks of local churches that all in the same year decided to stop naming the men who once stood at their altars and gates. So now you find yourself surrounded not by noise but by its absence, an echo of lives unrecorded, names unspoken, deaths undocumented. These weren't just errors of oversight. They were decisions made by men in robes with ink on their fingers and authority in their hands. Decisions to let certain stories slip through the cracks of history as if they'd never existed at all. Imagine a fortress not under siege, but under silence. Stone walls that once echoed with the clang of arms and the chants of prayer now stand empty, windswept, and sealed. In many places across France, England, and the Iberian Peninsula commanderies, those self-contained Templar centers of power were found abandoned after the arrests. But what's more curious isn't just that they were left empty. It's that they were found leaderless. No trial, no documentation, no resistance. The doors were closed, the halls uninhabited, and the name of the man in charge had been wiped from both memory and record. The Templar commandery was no simple outpost. It was a hybrid of monastery barracks and bank. These were logistical hubs where men-trained horses were kept ready, harvests were recorded, and goods were distributed. Each was run by a commander or preceptor, a man of noble background, military experience, and considerable theological training. His role wasn't ceremonial. He was responsible for all legal, financial, and spiritual operations. He signed the books. He held the seal. His absence, if sudden or unexplained, should have triggered an official inquiry. Instead, what we find in dozens of cases is a void. At the commandery of Arville in northern France, the property was seized in late 1307 by royal officials. They found grain stores, intact horses still in the stables, and Templar brothers milling in the courtyard. But there was no commander. No one seemed to know where he had gone. His chambers were locked. His name was not listed in the arrest inventories. When interrogated, one brother simply replied, "He was not here." That was the end of it. Further south in the commandery of Richeronches in Provence, an even stranger detail emerges. The commander had last been documented just weeks before the arrests, signing a land grant to a nearby Cistercian abbey. The deed still bore his personal seal, yet when church officials arrived, his name was not listed in the registry. The other brothers would only say he departed on the business of the order. No one could or would say where. He was never seen again. Some commanderies attempted to offer explanations. In a few royal inventories, notes read, "Commander not present or house found without master." These statements were written with curious neutrality, not as red flags, but as mundane observations. It's almost as if the officials expected these places to be missing their leaders. There's a practical theory here. Perhaps these men had advance warning. Perhaps a whisper from within the church or a letter from a sympathetic bishop gave them time to vanish. But the absence of any follow-up investigation is what truly defies logic. In medieval legal procedure, a missing officer of any religious order would trigger multiple layers of response: ecclesiastical inquest, local rumor appeals to the crown. Instead, the files were simply closed. In the commandery of Templecombe in England, documents show that the local sheriff arrived to seize the property. He catalogued the contents, including livestock, vestments, and scrolls. Yet in his report he writes, "Master not found. Property left to steward's care." The steward's name is listed. His deposition survives. But the master's name does not appear anywhere, not even as a missing person. And this isn't a quirk of incomplete documentation. The surrounding records of transactions, confessions, land redistribution are precise and intact. Only the names of specific leaders are missing. It's as though the scribes were instructed to write around them. This leads to a darker speculation. Perhaps the absence was intentional, not just on the part of the leaders, but on the part of those documenting the transition. If a commander was seen as inconvenient politically, spiritually, or otherwise, then writing him out may have served as a means of preemptive control. No trial, no execution, no sainthood. Just omission. One particularly chilling discovery comes from a letter attributed to the Archbishop of Sens, written in 1309. In it, he remarks, "There are houses from which the shepherds have fled or been led away. Their absence is not to be questioned further." That line, "not to be questioned further," might as well be a directive from history itself. Some have proposed that the commanderies were taken over by rival factions within the Church, who sought to ensure a smooth transfer of property. The sudden appearance of hospitaller representatives at several sites supports this idea. But even the hospitallers in their own inventories occasionally list properties as having no former master recorded. And then there's the matter of succession. When a Templar leader died or departed, the order followed strict rules for replacing him. The absence of succession documents for so many properties suggests that no formal death or dismissal was ever acknowledged, which implies yet again erasure rather than absence. It's tempting to see these empty commanderies as accidents of war or bureaucratic failure. But the consistency of their silence and the eerie calm with which they were recorded tells a different story. These weren't fortresses breached in battle. They were quietly, surgically depopulated, their leaders not overthrown, but made to vanish. And somewhere beneath these stones, you begin to feel the shape of a pattern too deliberate to ignore. The Templars owned a staggering amount of land farms, vineyards, mills, entire villages stretching from the Scottish Highlands to the sunburnt plains of Castile. Their holdings were vast, intricate, and catalogued down to the last bale of hay. So when the order was dismantled, one might expect an equally methodical transfer of property. In many cases, this is precisely what happened. Royal clerks, church officials, and opportunistic nobles moved in tallying and seizing. Yet again, as with so many parts of this vanishing act, anomalies appear. Properties were confiscated with no accompanying charges. Estates were absorbed while the names of those who ran them disappeared, not after trial, not after guilt, but before explanation. Begin in Burgundy. A region with deep Templar roots, it had long served as a recruiting ground and economic stronghold. In early 1308, King Philip's agents filed a property inventory for the region. The document lists over a dozen estates newly absorbed by the crown. It includes details on grain yields, vineyard output, livestock, and tax obligations. But the column meant to identify each estate's commander is curiously empty, not blank from oversight, but replaced with terse notations like "in transition" or "steward acting." No reason is given for the leader's absence, and more tellingly, no mention is made of any formal accusation. One such estate near Autumn had belonged to the order since the 1240s. The preceptor documented in a prior year's tax record as Brother Garnier had a reputation for strict governance and occasional correspondence with local bishops. Yet when the estate was seized, no record of his fate was filed. The land was transferred, the wine was counted, the sheep were branded with a new mark, but the man unnamed, untried, forgotten. You might think this was the exception. It isn't. In southern England, royal records list 6 Templar holdings absorbed into the royal domain in 1309. For 4 of them, no human occupants are recorded. One entry reads simply, "The manor once of the temple now in care of the reeve." No indication of who the reeve replaced. No note of arrest or fleeing. Just ownership changed, and that was apparently enough. This opens an unsettling window into the motives of those overseeing the Templars' dissolution. Theoretically, the arrests were about heresy, justice, purification of the Church. But when land and goods are taken before any guilt is established, and sometimes without any charges at all, you begin to see a different engine behind the purge. The Pope himself had ordered that Templars were not to be condemned without trial. Property was to remain in Church hands, not be seized by kings. But Philip IV, ever the debt-strapped strategist, moved quickly to intercept. In many regions, confiscation came first, documentation later. By the time the Church tried to organize formal proceedings, the estates were already in royal coffers. In the Pyrenean foothills, records from the Aragonese crown reveal a similar tactic. A Templar house at Lleida was turned over to hospitaller care, despite no formal trial against its commander. The Aragonese clerks note that no accusations have been found, but also write that the possessions have been placed in more suitable custody. More suitable. That's an elegant way to say more convenient. The recurring theme is chilling. Not just the disappearance of men, but the erasure of cause. These weren't cases of proven guilt swept under a rug. They were removals without even the courtesy of a pretext. And the records, usually so eager to document transgression, stay quiet. An alternative theory holds that some leaders willingly surrendered their properties to avoid bloodshed or chaos. Perhaps they were told in veiled language to disappear, and the land would be taken peacefully. In return, they would not be hunted, tried, or named. It's speculative, yes, but in a world governed by fragile alliances and secret channels of diplomacy, it isn't hard to imagine. Silence in such a bargain would be its own form of currency. Another possibility is more cynical, that accusations were deliberately withheld to avoid public sympathy. In regions where the Templars were respected or feared, the sudden arrest or execution of a well-known commander might stir unrest. But a quiet transfer of land without names or headlines that slips beneath the surface. There's a final oddity that resurfaces in multiple confiscation reports. In the margins next to the list of goods, grain stores, tapestries, livestock, there are occasional notations like seal not recovered or banner removed prior. These suggest that someone had time to unhang the standard break, the wax, remove the insignia. In other words, they left in an orderly fashion. Not dragged away, not destroyed, but allowed to walk away before the door was bolted behind them. And if someone was allowed to walk, then someone else allowed it. The confiscations tell a story not just of loss, but of complicity. Estates don't run themselves. They don't vanish quietly. Someone made the decision to seize property without asking questions about the men who held it. And those decisions were recorded cold, clean, legalistic in ink that still speaks across 7 centuries. Yet it's what those records refuse to say that tells you the most. You'd think erasure would be crude. Ink crossed out with a shaky line. A hasty X beside a name. A burnt page. But in the case of the Templar leadership, the erasure was elegant, surgical, entirely official. Their names weren't just forgotten, they were removed, and not always in haste. Sometimes it happened slowly, deliberately, years after the order had already crumbled. The evidence begins in the margins, literally. In several surviving church records from the 1310s and 1320s, scholars have noticed subtle alterations. Words scraped off with pumice stone, sentences re-inked with different handwriting, and most importantly, entire names that had once been part of the administrative record now vanished. Not missing due to time, not damaged by water or neglect, but visibly struck from the parchment, leaving behind the ghost of a signature. Start with the charters of the Diocese of Limoges. In a 1306 register, a donation is listed to the temple house at Calais, signed by a certain Brother P. The name is incomplete, ending in a jagged scar where the ink has been lifted. The line following his name, which once recorded his position, is also affected. When compared to a copy of the same document preserved in a Cistercian archive, the name is intact, Brother Pierre Dasquez, commander of Calais. That copy, uncorrected, proves that the name was once considered legitimate. Its later removal was not a clerical adjustment, but a conscious decision. And this wasn't an isolated case. In Avignon, fragments from the Liber Memorandorum, a kind of papal executive logbook, show instances where appointments of Templar officials were struck through in later ink. The names weren't always blotted out entirely. Some were faded, others simply omitted in copied versions of the same document. When those names correspond to leaders we already know vanished from the trial records and arrest lists, the pattern grows more disturbing. One possible explanation is bureaucratic normalization, the Church cleaning up the books after the dissolution of the order. If the Templars no longer existed, then the titles and names in prior entries may have been deemed unnecessary. But that doesn't explain why in the same books the names of lower-ranking brothers were allowed to stand. Nor does it explain the unevenness some Templar commanders remained in the record, while others were effaced with such precision it seems intended to leave no trace. This brings us to the scribes. Medieval scribes weren't just passive copyists. They were gatekeepers. Many were monks trained to understand the theological and political weight of what they recorded. If instructed to remove a name, especially by a superior, they would obey. And unlike modern deletions, these removals left few fingerprints. Vellum once scraped clean could be written over. Names could be faded to illegibility, struck out with ecclesiastical shorthand, or omitted in the next copy. All of it wrapped in the quiet authority of the Church. It's here that the motive becomes murkier. Some argue these redactions were to protect the memory of those who had been implicated in heresy, but not convicted. Better perhaps to erase a name than let it stand with a question mark. But if that were true, the practice would be widespread. Instead, it appears targeted, reserved for specific figures. Regional leaders, estate commanders, men who wielded both knowledge and influence. One of the clearest examples comes from the Liber Capituli of the Dominican order. This book, kept in Toulouse, originally listed a correspondence between the order and a Templar leader in 1305 regarding shared use of land. In a 1312 revision, the name of the Templar is absent. The sentence ends mid-thought, followed by a new paragraph that begins awkwardly as if something had been excised. A later margin note in a different hand reads, Nulla memoria ejus maneo. No memory of him remains. And therein lies the sinister brilliance of the tactic. To strike a name from a church record was not just to forget, it was to forbid memory. These were not erasures of convenience. They were moral executions. Historians have long known of excommunication, of damnatio memoriae, of public condemnation. But this was quieter. No flames, no trumpets, just parchment edited. Even more haunting are cases where only the title remains. The preceptor of Aquitaine is referenced in a court record, but no name is attached. Just the roll left floating like a ghost stripped of identity. It's like a tombstone with no epitaph standing in a graveyard of paper. You begin to realize that this was more than censorship. It was strategy. The Church, or perhaps certain factions within it, understood that eliminating the memory of certain Templar leaders served a double purpose. It absolved responsibility and prevented future inquiries. You can't investigate a man whose name you can't find. You can't question the fate of someone the archives claim never existed. And in doing so, the institution preserved a particular version of history, one in which the fall of the Templars was orderly, just, and complete. The missing leaders don't fit that story. Their survival, their silence, their knowledge, all of it posed a threat to the official narrative. So they were struck out, not in vengeance, not in chaos, but in ink. Quietly, elegantly. And we're only beginning to find the places where they were supposed to be. There's a strange kind of silence that doesn't come from absence, it comes from avoidance. A record that should exist, but doesn't. A voice that should be transcribed, but never was. Among the mountain of paperwork generated during the Templar trials, thousands of interrogations remain intact. Endless confessions, retractions, tortured admissions, tearful denials. But in a growing number of cases, there's nothing at all where a name should have left its mark. Entire interrogations that never happened, or were never written down. It begins with patterns. In regions where Templars were known to be arrested and where properties were seized, you'd expect a matching series of interrogations. Names, places, dates. Yet again and again, the roster of those arrested does not align with the list of those questioned. It's as if people vanished between capture and court. And while some may have died or fled, the frequency and repetition of this gap raise deeper suspicions. In the Inquisition records from Toulouse, over 80 Templars were reportedly detained. Yet only 56 interrogations are recorded. Not a few missing pages, a full third simply unaccounted for. When local clerks were asked years later about this discrepancy, their answers were evasive. The remainder were not available for questioning. That's it. No further explanation. Now imagine the logistics. These trials weren't casual affairs. They were structured, scheduled, supervised by papal representatives. Witnesses were summoned. Protocols enforced. For a prisoner to simply not be questioned was highly irregular. And when that prisoner held a leadership title, when his name had previously appeared in donation records, local inventories, or royal correspondence, the absence becomes even more glaring. There's the haunting example of Brother Aymeric, once the commander of a major estate in southern Champagne. His name appears in a list of those arrested on October 13, 1307. He's documented as being transferred under guard to Paris. But when the Paris interrogations begin, he's not among them. No record of his testimony. No transfer to another court. No death notice. Just a name. And then not even that. This is not a matter of lost parchment. The surrounding records are intact, right down to the confession of the kitchen boy who claimed to have overheard heretical chants. If the lowliest novices were questioned in detail, why were certain leaders never heard from? One theory points toward quiet executions, that some men were killed before trial, perhaps to prevent them from speaking. But that doesn't explain the meticulous absence of their names afterward. If they'd been executed, their deaths would likely have been noted, especially in a church eager to display its justice. But in these cases, the paper trail doesn't end, it simply stops forming in the first place. Another more unsettling theory is that some interrogations did take place, but were removed after the fact. Whispers of this practice appear in later papal correspondence. A 1311 letter from Cardinal Arnaud Nouvel includes a cryptic line: certain testimonies have been deemed dangerous to retain and were thus excised. He doesn't name the testimonies, but he does mention the region Languedoc, which coincidentally is home to multiple commanderies whose leaders appear to have never spoken on record. The reasoning, we might suspect, goes beyond heresy. If certain Templar officials had knowledge of church corruption, royal debts, or illicit dealings between France and Avignon, their words may have been considered incendiary. Not just politically inconvenient, but institutionally destabilizing. The church was on thin ice, An outburst under torture from a man with detailed knowledge of papal finance could be catastrophic. There's also the possibility of defiance. Some leaders may have refused to speak. Silence as a weapon. But even then, protocol dictated that refusal be recorded. The very act of resistance would have become part of the trial transcript. Yet we find nothing. Not even a note of refusal. Just non-existence. And then there's the issue of the lost scrolls. In at least 3 known cases, Paris-Dijon and Avignon contemporary documents refer to bundles of interrogation notes that no longer exist. They were listed in inventories, mentioned in letters, and then gone. Vanished from the archive, or perhaps never deposited at all. It is possible some historians believe that these scrolls were quietly destroyed or locked away in private libraries, inaccessible to even papal auditors. All of this raises a question larger than any single name who controlled what got written down. The scribes may have held the pens, but they were rarely the ones making decisions. In Paris, the interrogations were overseen by men like Guillaume de Paris, Philip IV's confessor and inquisitor, a man known for his ideological rigidity and close alignment with the crown. In Avignon, papal representatives held more sway, but they too were under immense pressure to contain the scandal. When it served the church to remember, it remembered. When it served the crown to reveal, they revealed. But when both institutions feared what might be said, the parchment stayed blank. What we're left with are interrogation records that hum with absence, not missing due to accident, but silence chosen like a scalpel. In the end, the most chilling confession isn't the one written down. It's the one that was never allowed to be heard. There's something strangely theatrical about a public trial, a performance where guilt is shouted, verdicts are proclaimed, and the audience is satisfied. But not everyone gets a stage. Some disappear behind the curtain before the lights come up. When it comes to the missing Templar leaders, one theory grows louder with each unopened door. They weren't lost. They were taken, not by assassins or shadows, but by kings. Quietly, legally, into custody so secret, the paper trail itself was hushed. Consider King Philip IV of France, a monarch more banker than warrior. His treasury was threadbare, his debts to the Templars colossal. It wasn't just about heresy, it was about leverage, control, ownership. When the mass arrests began in 1307, it was Philip's men, not the church, who carried out the first wave. His orders were precise, his methods swift. And for many Templars, especially those of rank, it wasn't the Inquisition who came for them, it was the king's bailiffs. The royal archives tell us part of the story. In several surviving records from the Trésor des Chartes Templar, leaders are listed not as prisoners of faith, but as royal detainees. No mention of heresy. No spiritual oversight. Just a name, an estate, and a note held under royal jurisdiction. Some of these men never reappear in church proceedings. No interrogation, no execution, no absolution. They simply remain held. One such case is Brother Gérard de Villiers, a high-ranking Templar who served as Visitor of France, a role akin to an Inspector General. His name appears in several property documents just before the arrests. Then a royal register from 1308 lists him as transferred under secure escort. But there's no indication where he was taken. No trial follows. No mention of death. Just the record of a man moved, and then erased. Similar patterns surface in Aragon and Castile. In Spain, the monarchy was cautious, while pressure from the papacy mounted royal councils hesitated to follow France's lead. But in internal reports to the crown, certain Templar leaders are noted as received for consultation, a phrase so vague it could mean anything from diplomatic briefing to house arrest. One document from 1309 simply states, Commander of the Valley House arrived in quiet manner. Will not face ecclesiastical review. Will not face ecclesiastical review. That's not ambiguity. That's a choice. This shadowy custody arrangement may explain why so many names never enter the trial records. If the Crown deemed them valuable as sources, as negotiators, or as hostages, it had every reason to keep them away from the spectacle of heresy charges, especially if those charges wouldn't hold up under testimony. There's also the delicate matter of information management. Templar leaders were more than just warriors. They were financial agents, military logisticians, international diplomats. Some may have known the extent of royal debt. Others may have known of secrets better left buried, church land swaps, failed crusade plans, or even illicit deals between France and the Papal States. Letting these men testify even under torture was a risk neither king nor pope may have been willing to take. Which brings us to the strange phenomenon of the quiet prison. In medieval France, there were places not listed in official rosters. Small castles, fortified abbeys, rural estates leased to the crown, all used at times to detain sensitive figures. Not tortured, not tried, just held. A 14th century chronicler named Guillaume de Nangy, writing with careful detachment, mentions that certain brothers of the temple were placed in towers where neither monk nor magistrate was permitted to visit. He offers no names, but his implication is chilling that the highest-ranking Templars may have been hidden not from the world, but from the Church itself. The trail continues faintly in a 1310 letter from a papal envoy who laments that several former commanders are in royal houses and not yet made available to the inquisitorial process. This was 3 years after the arrests. 3 years, and still no clarity on their location. Even more suggestive is the correspondence between Philip IV and his sheriffs. In several documents, the language used to describe these men shifts from prisoners to wards. That distinction matters. A prisoner is a threat. A ward is an asset. It's also worth noting that after the dissolution of the order, some of these properties used as informal prisons became unusually well-funded. A few castles received sudden grants, supply upgrades, even new stonework, all in places otherwise irrelevant to royal politics. Perhaps these were merely strategic investments, or perhaps they were hush money in the form of mortar and meat. This royal custody theory also fits neatly with the phenomenon described in earlier accounts, the confiscation of properties with no recorded accusations. If the leaders were quietly absorbed into state control, their estates could be folded into the treasury without trial, without fuss, without evidence. So what does it mean when men vanish into the mechanisms of monarchy? It means we have to ask not just what the Church did, but what it allowed the crown to do in its name. And it means the story of the missing Templars may not be a tale of martyrdom, but of transaction. There are stories that hide behind diplomacy, quiet rivalries cloaked in ceremony. And in the case of the Templar disappearance, one of the deepest tensions wasn't between knights and heretics, but between two thrones, one of gold, the other of God. The papacy and the French crown. Each wielded immense power. Each claimed divine favor. And when it came to the fate of the Templars, each pulled in different directions, often pulling the records apart in the process. At the heart of it stood Pope Clement V, a Frenchman elevated to the papacy in 1305, with heavy strings still attached to Philip IV. From the beginning of his tenure, Clement found himself walking a narrow, slippery bridge between appeasing the king and protecting the sanctity of the Church. It was Clement who initially opposed the arrest of the Templars, insisting on ecclesiastical control. But it was also Clement who later issued the Pastoralis Praeeminentiae, instructing Christian monarchs to arrest Templars on behalf of the Church. This dance a step forward, two back created a legal storm. Who had the authority to arrest, to interrogate, to condemn? And in the swirling winds of that jurisdictional confusion, men vanished. The French crown made its position brutally clear. The Templars were a threat, not just to theology but to royal solvency. Philip owed the order enormous sums. Their network rivaled his own intelligence. So when he struck, it wasn't in subtlety. His agents moved fast, confiscated assets, detained knights, and began crafting a case before the church had caught its breath. To Philip, this wasn't spiritual cleansing, it was preemptive asset control. But the church, as slow and methodical as ever, resisted. Not openly, not defiantly, but through process. Papal inquiries were organized, legal frameworks proposed, and perhaps most tellingly, evidence was reviewed and sometimes not recorded. Consider the Avignon registers. They contain hundreds of letters, edicts, and responses about the Templar affair. But the tone changes over time. Early documents reflect concern, even outrage, at Philip's unilateral action. Later documents show resignation, and in between gaps. Communications from key dioceses disappear from the sequence. Certain responses are acknowledged, but the replies themselves no longer exist. That kind of fracture often points to internal conflict. One part of the church recording, another part deleting. Or worse, one part complying with the king's demands, while another tries quietly to shield what it can. This bureaucratic tug-of-war left trails. A 1308 letter from the papal notary Bertrand de Gaulle mentions a list of regional preceptors submitted to Avignon, then withdrawn pending review. The list itself has not survived. We only know of it from that line, but it suggests the Church had at one point access to the names of high-ranking Templars, and for reasons unstated chose not to preserve them. And that may have been no accident. It may have been a compromise. You see, if the Pope allowed Philip to run his purge unchecked, he risked becoming a puppet. But if he openly opposed the crown, he risked excommunication, political fragmentation, and even war. So a third path emerged: bureaucratic fog. Let the king seize who he pleased, but don't formally name the men. Don't record what they say. Don't open the church's ledgers to include their confessions or deaths. In effect, let Philip act, but don't let the papacy confirm it. This duplicity is visible in the Chinon parchment, a document rediscovered in 2001 in the Vatican's secret archives. It records the absolution of several top Templar officials by the Pope's envoys, including Grand Master Jacques de Molay. It proves that despite the public line of heresy, the Church found no definitive theological guilt. But the document was never circulated. It was buried, forgotten on purpose. And that again may explain the silence around so many missing leaders. If absolution was given in private without publicity, those men could disappear without public contradiction. No need for trial, no need for execution, no need for papal scandal, just silence. Meanwhile, Philip's court made its own edits. French royal records often omit references to papal mandates. Confiscations proceed without ecclesiastical consent. In some cases, inquisitors sent by the Pope were denied access to prisoners. In others, they were given access, but only after the king's men had done their work and the narrative had been shaped. One notorious instance involves the preceptory at Metz. A papal delegate arrived weeks after the local commander had been taken. No one would say where he was. The commander's name, recorded in earlier church donations, was missing from all royal paperwork. When the delegate demanded access, he was told the matter was already resolved. But no resolution was ever filed, just an absence, an invisible boundary between crown and church too dangerous to cross. This clash of authority may seem abstract, but it played out on parchment, on whose names made the lists and whose were erased, on which confessions were copied and which were never heard, on which deaths were recorded and which were buried in unspoken agreement. So when we ask where the missing leaders went, we may also be asking who blinked first. Was it the king rewriting history through force, or was it the papacy choosing silence over conflict? Perhaps both. In any great scandal, it's the witnesses who stitch the story together, the ones who saw, who heard, who stood on the edges of something vast and unexplainable. During the Templar trials, hundreds of witnesses were called. Some were fellow knights, others were local clergy peasants or former servants. Their testimonies make up an eerie patchwork of suspicion, fear, and routine. But tucked between the lines, there's a different kind of absence, not of what they say, but of who they don't name. Key figures are alluded to, referenced in cryptic ways, or spoken of with hesitation, as if the witnesses knew what not to say, or whom not to name. Begin in Poitiers. The court there was relatively thorough, and its surviving records are among the more complete. Yet even here, when witnesses were asked about the hierarchy of the local temple houses, they faltered. One testimony refers to the one who was master at the time, but the name is left blank in the scribe's copy. Another witness recalls being present at a ceremony conducted by the senior brother, whose name I do not remember. The phrasing is conspicuous. These are not illiterate peasants, but fellow Templars trained in obedience and memory. They knew the names of their superiors. Their omission is not forgetfulness, it is avoidance. In some cases, scribes appear to have replaced names with titles. The preceptor, the visitor, the one from the south. It's all remarkably consistent. Specificity, the very thing trials thrive upon, dissolves into abstraction. When pressed, witnesses either claimed ignorance or shifted the topic entirely. Some historians argue this was a result of trauma or fear of implicating themselves, but the trend goes far beyond that. It happens across regions, across languages, across years. There's a telling example in the Rouen transcripts. A knight under questioning admitted that a senior figure had instructed him not to speak during gatherings. When asked for the man's name, the knight paused. The transcript even notes the pause and replied, "He has since gone where no man follows." It reads more like a proverb than a statement. But what kind of man goes where even church prosecutors dare not tread? This evasiveness points to several possibilities. One, that the men in question had already disappeared, and witnesses feared the consequences of revealing their names. Two, that the names were known to be protected not by the church, not even by the king, but by something more local, more insidious. Perhaps a network of monastic allies, perhaps rogue nobles, or perhaps the order itself still moving in hidden channels. In some depositions, the tone changes when questions turn toward leadership. Witnesses who are otherwise cooperative begin giving vague, clipped answers. They don't recall the man's face. They weren't present at the relevant moment. They only heard things secondhand. Inquisitors, for their part, seemed unwilling to push. The notes often shift topics quickly, leaving the loose threads dangling. That reluctance might be strategic. In the volatile atmosphere of the early 14th century, pinning a name to a figure could be dangerous. If the man had escaped, naming him might draw retaliation. If he was in royal custody, the crown might view the church's curiosity as meddling. If he had been quietly sheltered by ecclesiastical allies, naming him would implicate the very men leading the trials. One especially revealing case comes from the interrogations in Sens. A Templar witness named Brother Amory repeatedly referred to our true master, though Jacques de Molay was already in custody by this point. Amory's phrasing was deliberate. He did not say the Grand Master, but our true master implying a living figure still in motion. Asked for clarification, he hesitated and replied only, "He is not to be named by me." The scribe underlined that sentence. It is one of the few times in the entire dossier that such emphasis appears. It's easy to dismiss this as superstition or ritual secrecy. After all, the Templars were famously bound by oaths. But even oaths have limits when torture and the threat of burning loom. If these men refused to speak, or if their scribes refused to write, something deeper was at play. And then there are the testimonies that simply disappear. Several known depositions from the Toulouse trials are referenced in later summaries, but the originals are gone. One such testimony was reportedly given by a knight named Bertrand de Caux, who spoke of a hidden house where leaders still sent messages. Later records mention Bertrand again, but his original statements are missing. Whether destroyed, sealed, or deliberately unrecorded, we can only speculate. It's worth noting that in multiple cases the chroniclers themselves express frustration. A Franciscan observer wrote of names left unspoken by men who trembled to say more. A Dominican noted the brothers spoke with empty mouths. Their words were like smoke. Poetic, perhaps. But what kind of silence leaves that strong an impression? The pattern is undeniable. Witnesses allude, gesture, imply, but rarely accuse. They name the guilty only when the guilty are already condemned. But those who had slipped away, their names seem forbidden, as if memory itself had become a liability. So when you look at the trial records, don't just read what's there. Listen to what's missing. The cough before the answer. The abrupt change in topic. The absence that trembles behind the ink. Because sometimes the truest evidence of a man's importance is how carefully others refuse to speak his name. Death for the medieval church was never the end, at least not administratively. When a man of rank passed, especially within a religious order, the record of his burial was as sacred as his baptism. It was not merely noted, but ritualized. Dates, locations, vestments, witnesses, even the type of soil were written down in ledgers with solemn care. So when you begin combing through the funerary rolls of Templar strongholds, you expect to find the final echoes of their leaders. What you find instead is a chilling silence. Not just a missing name here or there, but long, uninterrupted stretches of nothing. The Templars buried their own with precision. As both a military and religious order, they held death to be sacred and honorable. Commanders were laid to rest within chapel walls or beneath carefully marked stones. Their passing was recorded in necrologies confirmed in abbey registries and remembered in liturgical prayers. In places like Lyon-Dijon and Arles, you can still read the entries, plain Latin on yellowed parchment, that record the deaths of lower-ranking brothers. But when it comes to the high preceptors, the provincial masters, and the stewards of entire regions, silence. Take the commandery at Monsonès, nestled in the Pyrenees. It had functioned as a key node between France and Aragon, controlling trade routes and hosting senior Templars on their way to meetings and councils. The burial book of the nearby Cistercian abbey records Templar interments well into the 1290s. Then nothing. From 1302 onward, no Templar of rank is recorded as buried there. Not during the arrests, not after. It's as though they simply ceased to die, or more likely ceased to be acknowledged in death. This void isn't a solitary case. In the Benedictine records of Saint-Ouen in Normandy, a note from 1305 mentions the passing of a brother of high regard from the temple buried with honors and prayers. Yet by 1307, all references to Templar burials cease, even as evidence suggests several knights remained active in the area until their sudden disappearance. When the church later seized the surrounding lands, no graves were mentioned, no remains disturbed, no names mourned. What makes this especially odd is that burial was an act deeply entangled with doctrine. Denying burial or omitting it from the record was not neutral. It was a judgment. It meant exclusion from liturgical memory. It meant erasure from the prayers of the faithful. And while heretics were often denied such honors, that was usually made explicit. Excommunicatus, the scribes would write, or simply unworthy. But for these vanished leaders, there is no condemnation, just omission. The Hospitallers, who absorbed many former Templar properties, maintained their own necrologies. These too contain tantalizing gaps. A list from 1312 detailing the occupants of a former Templar house in Aquitaine includes a marginal note, place cleansed. No brothers found buried. The phrasing is strange, no brothers found buried, as if someone had looked and expected to find graves, and didn't. One explanation might be reburial, that the Templars, fearing desecration or posthumous humiliation, relocated their dead before the Church could get to them. But there is no record of such efforts, and more importantly, no local memory. In regions where reburial happened, it left traces, oral tradition, physical evidence, confusion in parish records. Here we find none of that. Alternatively, the deaths themselves may never have been acknowledged, because the men didn't die under conventional circumstances. If, as previous sections have suggested, some leaders were taken into royal custody, exiled, or sheltered in secrecy, their eventual deaths may have occurred far from the institutions that would normally record them. A man buried under an assumed name in a remote priory would vanish from history without a whisper. But then there's the darker possibility that some were denied burial altogether, that they died in silence behind stone walls or locked towers and were buried without ceremony. Or worse, left unburied, unblessed, their memory deliberately untethered from the sacred. A particularly unnerving account comes from an anonymous Carthusian monk, writing in 1320, who describes fields once consecrated, now plowed with secrecy, where no stone names the fallen. The location is never specified, but the tone is unmistakably funereal and accusatory. It may also be significant that in church calendars, where commemorations for the dead were inscribed for yearly remembrance, Templar leaders vanish after 1307. These calendars were compiled by clerics meant to be recited aloud in Mass. And while lower-ranking brothers continue to appear in some, the high offices go unmentioned. Their anniversaries, once sacred, are left blank. One historian called it liturgical murder, a killing not of the body, but of remembrance. If death is the final entry in a man's story, then the missing burial records of the Templars represent a refusal to close the book. Their endings were not just ignored, they were withheld. You are left with men who held power, walked the corridors of command, and then dissolved into nothing. Not merely killed, not merely lost, but denied the one thing the medieval church promised all the faithful, a recorded, remembered return to dust. And so beneath the stones of chapels, behind the walls of monasteries, the space where their names should be remains cold and silent, not because they were forgotten, but because someone made sure they would not be remembered. If the medieval church was an empire of paper, then the scribes were its silent emperors. The men who held the quills, hunched in cloisters, eyes reddened by lamplight, weren't just copying history, they were deciding it. Every name they wrote down lived. Every name they omitted faded. And when it came to the fate of the missing Templar leaders, the hands that recorded their stories or refused to may have been as important as the kings and popes who commanded their downfall. Start with the basics. Medieval clerks, especially those trained in the ecclesiastical hierarchy, followed rigorous systems. Everything was indexed, cross-referenced, copied, and sealed. but it was also manual, personal, and prone to influence. Orders came down the chain, and when the chain trembled, so did the record. A command to leave a name off the list didn't need to be accompanied by a threat. It only needed to be understood. In some dioceses, the handwriting itself betrays the discomfort. A sudden change in ink tone, a cramped line where the rest of the page flows naturally. In the Avignon transcripts, one deposition begins mid-page, the heading awkwardly wedged above a decorative flourish, as if a scribe had been told to insert it long after the page had been completed. The testimony is short, vague, and lacks the usual header identifying the accused. Suspicious vary. And this wasn't just in France. In England, Italy, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, scribes worked under competing pressures. Royal mandates, papal directives, local politics. A single omission could be the result of haste or of whispered instruction. There are marginalia from papal registers, where a name is begun and then struck not aggressively, not in anger, but with the clean line of someone told no. Someone told to stop writing. One startling example appears in a record from the Diocese of Pamiers. A list of Templar properties is being inventoried with commanders' names beside each estate. Halfway through the page, there's an entry marked Commandery of Rumangou Brother G, followed by a sudden blot of ink. No correction. No new line. Just the next property neatly begun beneath. The name wasn't revised. It was erased, and the scribe never returned to it. This level of subtlety suggests training. Clerks weren't just mindless drones. Many were former monks or scholars. They had read Aristotle and Augustine. They understood nuance. And when the political temperature rose, they knew how to vanish a man in ink. Not flamboyantly, just efficiently. A missing name here, a skipped line there. A transcript copied without the offending entry. A folder lost in transition between one diocese and another. There's evidence that this wasn't always done willingly. In some cases, clerical notes express frustration. One marginal scribble beside a redacted section reads, simply, "Uta dictum est non scribere," as was said, "do not write." Not a clerical error, a direct order. Someone higher up had made the decision. The scribe simply complied. Of course, this wasn't limited to court records. Liturgical books, necrologies, even property ledgers reveal this hidden choreography of omission. In a codex from the Abbey of Cluny, a donation from a Templar preceptor is recorded only to be struck through with red ink years later. But the name of the donor is not replaced. It isn't even condemned. It's just removed. The act feels less like punishment and more like negation, as though history itself was being revised mid-sentence. And what about the copies? Copyists working decades later relied on original manuscripts to replicate trial records for church archives. But if the original was edited or incomplete, the copy would be even more so. And herein lies a clever mechanism, plausible deniability. A missing name might be explained by deterioration or by clerical oversight. But in truth, the damage had been done far earlier quietly by the first man who chose not to press his stylus to parchment. A few rare confessions by scribes scattered in memoirs and monastery letters admit the burden of selective recording. One Carthusian monk in Cologne wrote, "The names I did not write live in me still. I was told to protect the peace, not the truth." That line alone hints at an entire generation of educated men caught between conscience and obedience. And yet the system itself encouraged this discretion. In an age where memory and record were inseparable, the act of not writing was as powerful as any proclamation. A papal edict might be read aloud in town square, but if it didn't make it to the registry, it was dust. This is how you hide people without hiding bodies. This is how memory becomes a battleground. So when we ask why so many leaders disappeared without a trace, we must look not only to the cathedrals and castles, but to the desks, to the inkpots, to the trembling fingers of men who understood the weight of a blank space. Because sometimes the most dangerous place in history is the space between lines. In medieval Europe, the written word could command armies, transfer kingdoms, or silence entire orders of men. Papal bulls, formal proclamations issued by the Pope, carried the weight of divine authority sealed in lead and dispatched by mounted couriers to every corner of Christendom. They were received with reverence, copied into cathedral archives, and cited in legal disputes for generations. And yet, within the volatile story of the Templar purge, there are bulls that vanish. Letters referenced by others, bulls acknowledged in response documents, that no longer exist, not torn, not erased, not hidden in some obscure collection, just missing. The most striking example appears in a letter from Cardinal Berenger Frédol, dated early 1308. In it, he references a directive from His Holiness, dated 3 weeks prior, regarding the treatment of temple preceptors now under crown custody. The cardinal even quotes a sentence from it urging discretion and respect for due process. But no such bull survives in the main Avignon registry. Cross-references fail. Other correspondences acknowledge receiving the document and then react to it, but the original is gone. Was it never copied? Doubtful. Papal secretaries were meticulous. Their jobs depended on the precision of the archive. A missing bull is more than a filing error, it's an institutional crisis. And when the only missing bulls are the ones that relate to specific Templar leaders, the coincidence becomes almost accusatory. Consider also the case of the so-called Instruction to Provence. Several inquisitorial proceedings in the south of France refer to a document supposedly issued by Clement V, ordering that certain named brothers be brought not to Avignon, but to a private council outside the formal Inquisition. The document is cited sometimes word for word by bishops in Arles and Nimes. But again, the bull itself has never been recovered. What remains is only the footprint, like a pressed seal in soft wax with the ring now lost. Scholars have tried to explain this phenomenon. Some suggest that the chaos of the Avignon papacy with its multiple registries and strained communication lines simply allowed for mistakes. A reasonable theory, but it falls apart under scrutiny. We have hundreds of bulls from this period preserved in pristine order. We have papal mandates about the price of salt, the breeding of horses, the number of bells in a monastery. And yet we've lost the bulls relating to the handling of a major international religious scandal, Loam. Something else is at play. One hypothesis is that certain bulls were never meant to survive. That is, they were deliberately dispatched, without being added to the registry, a quiet tool of papal diplomacy. A bull sent to satisfy the king's pressure or to reassure a local inquisitor, but without becoming part of the permanent record. This would make them unofficially official. Authorized, but deniable. And if such bulls carried instructions to protect, relocate, or silence Templar officials, then their non-survival would be a feature, not a flaw. Another possible explanation is internal sabotage. The papal court was not a unified body. It was a teeming hive of factions, jealousies, and theological debate. A bull issued by one chamber, say, under the influence of a sympathetic cardinal, might be intercepted or obstructed by another. There are anecdotal references to such rivalries. One Vatican librarian writing a generation later claimed that certain bulls of the Clementine era were destroyed in secret by those who feared their impact on the stability of the faith. Again, no names, but the tone is clear. Some bulls may also have been recalled, a rare but not unheard of act. If Clement issued an order and later deemed it unwise, he might have commanded its return. This would involve messengers, sealed dispatches, and strict orders to retrieve all known copies. And yet, even in such cases, the Church often kept a record of the recall itself. A note, an annotation, a correction in the margins. With the missing Templar documents, there is no such record. The trail ends without a trace. And let's not ignore the mundane dangers of paper in a medieval world, fire, flood, decay. But again, these forces are impartial. They don't select documents based on political convenience, and they don't leave behind multiple references to the existence of a document while erasing the document alone. You begin to see a strange negative space forming. Not where the words are, but where they were supposed to be, like shadows cast by letters no longer present. Orders that were given, obeyed, and then scrubbed. There's a final twist too. A case in Naples where a court transcript from 1311 includes a defendant referencing the papal letter that named me guilty before I had spoken. He insists the letter arrived before his interrogation listing charges already assumed, but no such letter is found in any known registry. His statement was dismissed, his confession extracted. But in his words, there lingers the memory of a document that shouldn't have existed or should never have been seen. So many of these lost orders relate not to the condemnation of the Templars, but to the exceptions. The ones not brought to trial, the ones not burned, the ones who slipped into paperless night. If the sword removed the Templars' bodies, perhaps it was the pen that removed their histories. Carefully, deliberately. With all the weight of the Church's most powerful tool, the decision not to remember. If the Templar disappearances were unique, if no other group saw their leaders vanish so quietly from the historical record, it would be tempting to call it a fluke. A perfect storm of political intrigue and missing parchment. But when you glance sideways beyond the Knights of the Temple, and into the structures of other religious orders of the time, you begin to see faint, familiar shadows. The erasure of names, the gaps in record, the silence that falls not from forgetting, but from intent. Start with the Hospitallers, the Knights of St. John. They were the logical inheritors of Templar property, at least in the eyes of the papacy. After the suppression of the Templars in 1312, many of their estates, commanderies, and treasures were transferred to the Hospitallers, though not without protest. It would have been a seamless transition had the documents all been intact. But they weren't. In Hospitaller records from Aragon and Provence, there are complaints not subtle but direct that certain estates arrived without knowledge of prior masters. A roll from 1315 lists more than 20 former Templar commanderies absorbed into the Hospitaller system, with no accompanying documentation of ownership transfer. The report notes no record survives of prior administration, testimony conflicting. Estates assumed under silence. It's the medieval equivalent of a shrug delivered with ink and a wax seal. And it wasn't just the Hospitallers. The Cistercians, a contemplative monastic order far removed from battlefield politics, also reported oddities. In a few scattered letters, abbots mention Templar brothers passing through en route to uncertain destinations. One writes in 1311 of a knight unnamed who bore the marks of high office yet sought no blessing, nor asked for food, nor gave his name. That's not folklore. It's a monk who sensed he was witnessing something he wasn't meant to record. In yet another account, the Teutonic Knights operating largely in the Baltic and Central Europe noted in a private letter, the arrival of a former brother of the temple received with caution and no ceremony. The letter's tone suggests nervousness. It's almost apologetic, as though the mere act of acknowledging the man was a risk. More telling is the fate of administrative overlaps. In areas where Templar and Hospitaller lands bordered one another, transitions should have been well documented. Property records, staff lists, agricultural inventories. Yet over and over we find partial or missing data. Where we should see the final Templar commander's name, there's just an empty title, or worse, a Latin abbreviation, meaning not reported, the most likely explanation. The last administrator had vanished before any formal handover could occur, or had been deliberately withheld from record. The Church's internal records echo this unease. A synod held in Naples in 1313 addressed, among other topics, the difficulty of reconciling conflicting records between the orders. Notes from the proceedings lament the lack of clarity in the transitional dossiers and express concern that many names of prior custodians have been lost or obscured. It's framed as a bureaucratic headache. But under the surface lies the same old pattern names that vanish not over time, but during a very specific, very recent moment in church history. What's especially curious is that this problem didn't occur with other suppressed or absorbed orders. When the Order of the Holy Sepulchre lost its prominence, records remained intact. When certain rogue orders were disbanded for heretical behavior, the Brothers of the Free Spirit, for instance, the Church recorded their demise in exhaustive detail, often with names, trial summaries, and memorial condemnations. Only the Templars, and more specifically, only some of the Templars, dissolve into narrative mist. It is as though a quiet policy was enacted. Not a formal doctrine, but a practice passed in whispers and winks. Let them disappear. Don't record what can't be explained. Let the new owners handle the assets and forget the men who once held the keys. Even later chroniclers noticed. A Dominican historian writing in the 1340s noted that the lands of the temple passed more easily than the men. We know where the stone lies, but not where the bones are buried. A metaphor, certainly, but also a warning. Stone and parchment endure. Names do not unless someone insists on writing them down. The faint echoes in other orders confirm what we've begun to suspect, that the disappearance of these Templar leaders was not merely a fluke of French ambition or papal cowardice. It was a model, perhaps even a template, repeated just enough elsewhere to suggest quiet coordination. And if this practice wasn't entirely unique, it wasn't entirely new. The machinery for erasure had already been oiled. All it needed was a reason. For the men who disappeared, there was another path, not a pyre, not a dungeon, but a border crossing. A quiet slipping into exile. No chains, no tribunal. Just one final glance over the shoulder before their names were swallowed by mountains, forests, or unfamiliar coastlines. If the theory of deliberate erasure holds, then exile would have been its softest version. No trial to falsify, no corpse to bury, no confession to redact. Just absence, clean and deniable. There are faint trails. Too faint perhaps to stand in a courtroom, but enough to follow with careful eyes. In Portugal, where the Templars were treated with unusual leniency, the entire order was rebranded rather than dissolved. King Denis, more politically astute than zealous, formed the Order of Christ, a continuation of the Templar tradition, under a new name. Many Portuguese knights joined it. Their identities and titles are well documented, but curiously, a handful of names appear in those early rosters that had not previously been associated with Portuguese commanderies. They match known and supposedly missing Templar officials from France, Aragon, and even Provence. One such name, Brother Raymond, is listed as a commander of a minor Portuguese house in 1313. The same name with the same birth province and prior rank matches a former Templar from southern France who was never tried, never sentenced, and never recorded as dead. He simply resurfaces, scrubbed, repurposed, tolerated. In Cyprus, a Venetian trader recorded a rumor of white-cloaked brothers disembarking quietly by night in the port of Limassol 3 years after the Templar arrests began. He assumed they were remnants of the military order returning from the Holy Land. But the timing is off. The Crusades were over. The ships weren't pilgrim vessels, they were private. The detail seems minor, until you learn that Cyprus, though under Latin control, was politically distant enough from Avignon and Paris to offer refuge. A place where allegiance could be quietly repainted. Even further afield, there are traces frustratingly thin that suggest some leaders escaped altogether. An obscure Florentine chronicler writing in the 1330s refers cryptically to 3 men of the Temple who went east beyond the reach of the Latin bishops. It's the kind of sentence a modern reader might dismiss as poetic license, until you recall that eastern territories, especially those around the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia or the declining Crusader ports, remained sympathetic to the old military orders. The Church's reach there was long, but not infinite. A more daring theory proposes that some of these exiles were orchestrated from within. That is, high-ranking church officials, sympathetic or fearful, facilitated the quiet relocation of key Templar figures, not under royal guard, but under monastic hospitality. The Benedictines, Cistercians, and certain Augustinian houses had the infrastructure, and in some cases, the motive. If protecting a man meant preventing a larger scandal, then it was worth the silence. Hints of this appear in a letter from a prior in Piedmont, who in 1310 wrote of accommodations being made for a traveler of cloaked service. The phrasing is deliberately opaque, but the implication is familiar: someone who should not be moving was being moved. And then there's the matter of the falsified deaths. A few ecclesiastical documents mention the deaths of Templar officials who were supposedly burned, but no eyewitnesses are cited. No public executions. Just a line, Brother X condemned and expired. Yet in adjacent records, these same men are referenced in present tense, or with duties reassigned without note of their death. It's as if the record were being guided toward a conclusion, while the man walked away. This idea of paper deaths enabling real escape isn't new. Medieval monastic orders occasionally used it to protect valuable insiders or to settle disputes without bloodshed. If a knight agreed to vanish live quietly and never resurface, his name could be declared dead and his influence neutralized. But exile was not always sanctuary. A man without a name lived at the mercy of those who sheltered him. A former commander reduced to anonymity could find himself cloistered, surveilled, or quietly excommunicated in all but name. He would breathe, eat, and pray, but not speak of the past. And perhaps some accepted that fate willingly. Perhaps they preferred silence to scandal. The men who had carried secrets for the temple may have chosen the same vow when it came time to preserve the church, the order's legacy, or even their own bloodlines. There is one more thread. In a monastery near Girona, an early 14th century registry includes a curious entry. It refers to Brother Petrus, once a man of arms, now in contemplation, not to be disturbed. No surname, no origin, but the surrounding entries are unusually careful, even reverent. It's not proof, but it feels like a trace. Because when exile becomes the tool of erasure, the goal isn't just distance. It's quiet. A life extended in exchange for a name forgotten. So if some Templar leaders escaped execution, it wasn't a mercy handed down by justice. It was a transaction. One parchment voided, one border. Crossed one name sealed away behind a monastery gate. And if they lived out their days in silence, perhaps it wasn't fear that kept them quiet, but duty. Not every silence is imposed from the outside. Sometimes it is sworn. woven into the bones of an institution, passed from tongue to tongue in the flickering shadows of a chapel at dusk. The Knights Templar were many things: warriors, bankers, architects, but above all, they were initiates of a deeply secretive brotherhood. Their hierarchy functioned not only by command, but by vow. And when those vows intersected with the chaos of suppression, they may have provided the perfect cloak for disappearance. From the moment a man joined the order, secrecy was embedded in his soul. Novices took oaths not only of chastity, poverty, and obedience, the common vows of all monastic orders, but of silence. Specifically, silence regarding internal rituals, hierarchical decisions, disciplinary actions, and spiritual doctrines. The rule of the temple, written in the 12th century and refined over decades, outlines strict prohibitions against revealing the inner workings of the brotherhood to outsiders even under duress. This wasn't symbolic. It was operational. At higher levels of command, these vows became more binding. The masters, preceptors, and visitors of provinces had access to more than logistics. They knew the order's secrets. Not mythical treasures or hidden gospels, but the practical machinery of its power, its financial networks, its alliances, its weaknesses. To speak of such things, even in defense, was forbidden, unless permitted by the master or the chapter. And when the order was declared heretical and dissolved, no such permission could ever be granted again. So what happens when a man trained to keep secrets is suddenly arrested, tortured, or offered freedom in exchange for confession? What happens when the very church he once served now demands he break the silence he swore to uphold? Some cracked. The records show as much. Confessions under torture names revealed ceremonies described, but others said almost nothing. And some, as we've seen, never spoke at all because they never appeared. One plausible explanation for the vanished leaders is this: they refused. Not just to confess, but to participate. They vanished into the folds of their own silence. Perhaps they were offered quiet exile. Perhaps they were detained but kept apart. Perhaps they died refusing to break their oath, and their silence was so complete that it extended into the records themselves. Not a word, not a line. The vow of secrecy wasn't just spiritual, it was legal. According to the rule, a brother could be expelled or demoted for revealing information to outsiders, especially if it concerned the master or the council. Even after the order's dissolution, former Templars might have believed the vow remained in force. Some may have feared eternal damnation more than earthly punishment. Others may have clung to the idea that the order could one day return and that their silence was its only surviving shield. This possibility takes on greater weight when we examine the strange consistency of non-testimony across regions. In multiple depositions, witnesses refer obliquely to our customs, our rights, or the brothers of higher rank, always without naming names. They talk around their leaders. They hint, gesture, defer, but they rarely accuse. And when asked directly why, some say, "I am not permitted." A curious phrase. Not able would imply forgetfulness. Not permitted suggests ongoing allegiance. Even after imprisonment, some former Templars were recorded as holding fast to internal rules. A bishop in Castile wrote in 1311 that certain brothers refused to eat meat on days not allowed, refused to uncover their heads, and continued to live under the rule despite its abolition. If they held on to dietary habits, imagine how fiercely they guarded their vows. And then there is the ritual itself. Initiation into the Templar Brotherhood was marked by oaths spoken in secret, often before dawn, in the presence of senior knights. These ceremonies varied slightly from region to region, but always included a pledge of secrecy, not just about the ritual, but about the identity of those present. A man swore not to reveal who had accepted him, who had witnessed his vow, or what was said in that moment. If that bond remained unbroken even as the order collapsed, then the silence of leadership was not merely evasion, it was doctrine. The men who vanished may have done so in deliberate obedience, becoming martyrs, not of the pyre, but of the unwritten. This theory also explains the absence of testimony from loyal subordinates. In multiple trial transcripts, Templars say things like, "I cannot speak of the commander's will," or "that which concerns the higher circle is not for me to say." These aren't legal defenses, they are theological positions. A refusal to speak born not of fear, but of faith. Of course, secrecy is a double-edged sword. It protected the order in its prime, allowing it to grow in wealth, influence, and autonomy. But in the end, it may have provided the perfect conditions for its disappearance. With no paper trail, no confessions, no witnesses, and no names, the leaders of the temple became ghosts. And the church, whether frustrated or complicit, had little reason to challenge that silence. Perhaps the most devout act a Templar could perform as his world fell apart was to vanish. Follow the money. It's a phrase as old as corruption itself, and in the case of the Templar disappearances, the trail of coin may explain far more than the official narrative ever intended. The Knights of the Temple were not just soldiers of God, they were financiers, landlords, lenders, bankers to kings, and when they fell, their assets were swallowed like water in dry earth. But curiously, the men who controlled those assets, the regional treasurers, the financial stewards, the provincial leaders, are among the most conspicuously missing. Start with the basics. At the height of their power, the Templars were managing vast sums. They issued loans to monarchs, safeguarded noble estates, and operated an early form of international banking, complete with letters of credit and secure transfer systems. Their treasuries were not kept in grand vaults in Paris alone, but scattered across Europe in fortified commanderies, each one run by a man of rank, trusted with the keys to both the vault and the books. These men had names. We know some of them: Brother Hugues de Beaune, the treasurer of Auvergne; Brother Juan de la Serna, in charge of the Aragonese circuit. Their signatures appear on documents from the early 1300s, authorizing the movement of silver, the sale of grain, the rental of vineyards. But when the arrests came in 1307, these same men vanish from view. No interrogation, no trial, no confession. And crucially, no record of what happened to the funds they oversaw. It is no small thing to say that the church and crown stood to benefit from such disappearances. The French monarchy under Philip IV was deeply in debt to the Templars. Estimates vary, but some records suggest the crown owed sums so vast they eclipsed its annual income. By removing the men who held the ledgers, the ones who could verify contest or complicate the financial picture, Philip effectively wiped out the order's memory and accountability. And this wasn't just a French strategy. In England, Edward II initially resisted the arrests, only complying with papal pressure months later. When he finally seized Templar properties, the accompanying inventories are tellingly vague. Lists of cattle grain vestments, but almost nothing about gold coinage or debt obligations. The clerks made careful note of the physical goods, but omitted the ledgers, as if the numbers had never existed. One interpretation is that the Templar treasurers were quietly bribed or bargained with, offered safe passage in exchange for silence. After all, if a man held the secrets to royal debt, he was more valuable alive and mute than dead and publicly examined. There's even a fragmentary letter from an English scribe in York who describes a brother of the temple taken not to court, but to the counting room where a new understanding was reached. The language is frustratingly cryptic, But the implication is clear negotiation, not prosecution. Further evidence emerges in the form of missing account books. In multiple instances, church and royal officials note the absence of financial registers, not lost over centuries, lost immediately after the arrests. In Provence, the bailiff of Avignon writes, "The strong boxes were seized, but the scrolls were not found." In Toulouse, the preceptor's room held the ledgers, but the pages were torn or carried away. Who removed them and why? If the goal were justice, preserving the financial records would have been essential. But if the goal were profit, then those records became a liability. They tied men of power to debts, obligations, promises made in ink. And in a world where gold was power, those books could topple kingdoms. We also see signs of reassigned funds. In some diocesan registers, donations to the church surge in the years after the Templar trials, sometimes without recorded donors. Anonymous endowments. Sudden influxes of coin into monasteries that had once struggled to maintain their roofs. It's hard not to suspect that at least some of this money came from vanished Templar treasuries redistributed under the blessing of silence. And then there are the absences that speak too loudly. In Aragon, a papal auditor noted in 1312 that the final balance sheet for the Templar commanderies could not be completed due to the loss of prior knowledge. A beautiful phrase, isn't it, loss of prior knowledge? As if the men who held that knowledge had never existed. If we accept that finance was the lever behind many of the arrests, then it's not difficult to imagine why certain men were removed without trial. Not because they were guilty, but because they knew. They understood the flows of wealth, the delicate balances of debt and favor. They could embarrass both church and king. Their silence wasn't bought with coins, it was insured by erasure. Because to confess was to implicate. To stand trial was to speak. And in a world built on fragile balances of power, it was safer for all involved that some names simply disappeared. Disappearances are rarely perfect. Even the most carefully orchestrated vanishing act tends to leave behind a loose thread, a shadow glimpsed, too long a name spelled slightly differently, a fragment of a life that shouldn't exist. In the aftermath of the Templar suppression, a few such shadows appear in places they shouldn't be, men who resemble the missing, but whose names don't match, whose histories begin just after others end. Could some of the order's high-ranking leaders have survived not just physically, but administratively re-emerging under new identities? The evidence is thin, but not imaginary. One example often cited by researchers is the case of a man named Brother Theobald of Montreuil, who appears abruptly in 1311 in records from a newly reorganized monastic house in central France. His prior history is vague, his entry into the brotherhood unrecorded. But multiple witnesses describe him as elderly, authoritative, and formerly of knightly rank. His seal resembles in shape and size those used by Templar preceptors. His Latin signature, which survives in a single charter, includes a flourish nearly identical to that of a missing Templar leader from Champagne. Coincidence, perhaps, but peculiar nonetheless. Other cases emerge from Iberia where the chaos of the trial years allowed for more creative resolutions. The Spanish Inquisition, not yet in full force, left regional control of Templar property and personnel to local monarchs and church leaders. In Aragon, a knight named Juan de Cardenas is listed in a 1314 document as overseeing a remote commandery-turned-hospital. No mention is made of his origins, but an earlier letter from 1306 refers to a Templar named Brother Johann de Cardeny, last seen managing an estate near the Pyrenees. The spelling is different. The location is not. In Portugal, the establishment of the Order of Christ allowed former Templars to continue their spiritual and military work under a new banner. For most, the transition was official names were retained, vows were renewed. But in at least 5 known cases, individuals appear in the early rolls of the order with only a single name, no surname, no title, and no record of profession. One of these, Brother Martinho, is listed as an advisor to the master, yet nowhere is it explained who he was before. Some believe he may have been one of the vanished provincial preceptors of Western France, given shelter and a new identity in exchange for loyalty and silence. The Church, for its part, rarely acknowledged such survivals, but it may not have opposed them either. In fact, in private correspondences between papal envoys, one letter includes the following sentence: "It is better they serve in new clothes than disturb the past in old ones." A cryptic phrasing easily overlooked, but when placed in context, it reads like tacit approval of identity laundering. A recognition that a quiet transformation was preferable to a loud reckoning. And then there's the phenomenon of legal documents that almost name someone. In legal disputes over property once held by the temple, new claimants occasionally cite a prior master or steward, but with alterations. The man once called Raymond, or he who served before the fall. The records use euphemisms, oblique references, and half-names, almost as if the scribes were writing with the expectation that the reader would understand without needing clarity. These vague placeholders may point to men who continued to operate in the region unofficially acknowledged, but never formally named. There's also the question of lineage. At least 2 noble families in southern France abruptly rise in wealth and landholdings in the years immediately following the Templar trials, despite no apparent change in royal favor. One theory is that former Templar leaders were absorbed back into their family estates, with wealth transferred discreetly and names erased to preserve reputations. A Templar commander could return home not in disgrace, but in disguise, a cousin, a steward, a suddenly pious uncle. But perhaps the most haunting piece of circumstantial evidence is the growing number of letters and legal records from the 1320s and 1330s that refer to former brothers' silent guests or men who once wore white. In none of these cases are names given. The references are delicate, respectful, and brief, but they hint at a population of survivors, men who lived on not as martyrs or fugitives, but as shadows in plain sight. And so you must ask, what does it mean to disappear? Is vanishing always a matter of death? Or can it be achieved with ink and silence, with a name changed by a single letter? A ring passed quietly from finger to finger. The Templars who survived may not have lit new fires. They may not have sworn new vengeance. They may have simply lived quietly, anonymously, and borrowed names and half-remembered titles. Not because they were cowards, but because the order had taught them that power often lies not in being seen, but in knowing when not to be. The Middle Ages gave birth to a strange kind of historian, part monk, part courtier, part archivist. Chroniclers weren't just storytellers, they were curators of political reality. They decided what future generations would remember, and just as often what they wouldn't. Their silence, carefully calibrated, is one of the most revealing absences in the Templar mystery. Because the chroniclers, for all their detailed prose on battles, kings, and saints, rarely questioned what happened to the men who vanished. You would expect the chroniclers of the 14th century to be fascinated by the sudden implosion of the Knights Templar. It was unprecedented, an international religious military order arrested, tried, and dissolved in less than a decade. And yet, when you scan the pages of the great monastic histories, the tone is eerily flat. There are few rhetorical flourishes, little indignation, and almost no speculation. The narrative is presented as settled. The order was accused, investigated, and ended. But the chroniclers knew better. Take the case of Geoffrey of Paris, a cleric and writer active during the very years of the trials. He wrote detailed verses about the downfall of the Templars, naming prominent figures like Jacques de Molay and commenting on public burnings. Yet he says nothing about the missing regional leaders. Nothing about the discrepancies in trial records, the gaps in arrest, lists the unmarked commanderies. For a man obsessed with political intrigue, his omissions are deafening. Other chroniclers, like the Dominican Bernard Guia, famed inquisitor and author of one of the most widely circulated manuals on heresy, mention the Templars only in passing. Guy's surviving writings focus on procedure, not individuals. He condemns errors in doctrine, defends papal authority, and cites confessions, but never once pauses to ask why certain commanders weren't named. His silence isn't ignorance, it's discretion. So why didn't they ask? One answer lies in self-preservation. Chroniclers depended on patronage from bishops, nobles, even monarchs. To question the official narrative was to risk livelihood protection, even excommunication. If a chronicler were to note the inconsistencies in the Templar records, to point out the men who vanished without trial, the bulls that were referenced but never produced, he would be wading into dangerous waters. Easier to echo the approved version of events. There's also the matter of access. Most chroniclers worked from secondary sources, public proclamations, trial summaries, sermons. The inner workings of papal courts or royal interrogations were not made available to monastic writers. Even if they sensed that something had been left out, they lacked the documents to prove it. And without proof, their duty was to record, not interpret. Yet some did leave behind quiet clues. A Benedictine chronicler in Hainaut wrote cryptically of men who wore the Red Cross and left no bones behind. Another in Italy described the order's end as not a fire, but a fog. These poetic metaphors suggest an awareness that something more had happened, but not the freedom to name it. Their restraint wasn't ignorance, it was survival. Some chroniclers may also have believed or been led to believe that the story was over, that the missing leaders had fled into disgrace or taken on lives of quiet penance. The public narrative, repeated often enough, became its own kind of truth. To contradict it required more than curiosity. It required access, courage, and immunity from punishment. Most chroniclers had only one of the three. And then there's the question of moral framing. To many ecclesiastical writers, the Templar scandal was not about individuals, it was about divine justice. The order had become proud, wealthy, secretive. Its fall was interpreted as inevitable. To dissect the details would be to question God's judgment, or worse, to suggest that fallible men had manipulated sacred justice. Chroniclers were writing not just for their contemporaries, but for posterity, and posterity demanded clarity, not ambiguity. This helps explain the uniform tone of certainty that creeps into most 14th century monastic histories. The Templars are condemned, their ashes scattered. Their leaders are either named and burned, or never mentioned again. No space is given to the gray zones. No space is given to the men who didn't make it into the flames or into the pages. And yet when we read those pages now, we feel the gaps. The sentences that stop too soon. The summaries that avoid names. The conclusions that seem too neat for the mess they describe. So perhaps the chroniclers did ask. Perhaps they whispered their questions in margins, in glances, in silences so deep that only now, centuries later, do we begin to hear them. Because in history, what isn't said can speak louder than what is. As each puzzle piece falls into place, the vanishing names, the blank registers, the exile rumors, the chronicler's omissions, a deeper shape begins to emerge. not a series of accidents, not a scattered trail of unrelated oddities, but a pattern. Quiet, deliberate, and spread across countries, languages, and ranks, a shape too large for any one document to hold and too consistent to be coincidence. It begins with the arrest lists where dozens of expected names never appear. These aren't peripheral figures, they're high-ranking Templar officials who should have been at the center of the storm. Their commanderies were seized, their subordinates interrogated, yet they themselves were never booked, never tried, never confessed. Their absence is not a clerical error. It is the first brushstroke in a larger design. Then come the trial records studded with blank spaces and cryptic testimonies. Witnesses allude to superiors who are not to be named orders given by men who are no longer with us, and ceremonial details spoken only in the inner circle. These phrases repeat like refrains in a liturgical chant, region after region, language after language, echoing the same void. Meanwhile, the financial records crumble around the same missing edges. Where money was once tallied, now there are torn pages. Where treasurers once signed their names, now there are blank seals. And wherever a treasury is found empty, or its ledgers absent, the same questions arise: who was responsible, and where did he go? Church records compound the silence. The papal registers from the years following the suppression show sudden gaps in correspondence. Letters alluding to orders no longer traceable. Summons sent to men who do not reply. Bulls drafted but never sent. Across France, Aragon, Tuscany. The same peculiar gaps in diocesan registers: no funeral masses held for certain preceptors. No transfers of authority, no mention at all. Even in burial rolls and ecclesiastical necrologies where the dead were named with dutiful precision, the missing persist. Commanders who had served for decades simply vanish with no grave, no prayer, no posthumous record. Their estates pass to new hands, but their names are not spoken, not mourned, not resolved. And the pattern does not stop with documents. It appears in testimonies. In Portugal, a former Templar, under questioning, insists that some brothers have taken new forms and serve quietly. In England, a monk speaks of the man who used to ride with the Red Cross, now tending vineyards under a saint's name. These are not grand conspiracy claims. They're murmurs, suggestions. But their repetition makes them hard to ignore. Some argue that these patterns could be the result of chaos, the noise of collapsing bureaucracy, conflicting jurisdictions, miscommunication across borders. But bureaucracy, even at its most chaotic, doesn't erase the same types of men in the same way across 5 nations. These weren't outlaws or rogue agents. They were structured, titled, appointed by the order's own internal hierarchy. If they were simply lost in the shuffle, the pattern would be random: a few in Castile, a few in Brittany, a few in the papal court. But instead, the pattern converges on command-level figures, men with authority over treasure rituals archives. Men whose absence benefits not just royal and papal interests, but also the internal silence of the order itself. It's here that the lines begin to cross: church strategy, royal debt, and internal Templar protocol, all intersecting. The French king had motive to suppress names that could testify to financial betrayal. The Pope had reason to shield the Church from deeper scandal. And the Templars themselves, trained in secrecy and loyalty, may have chosen to disappear rather than confess, to obey their final vow by vanishing rather than standing trial. The erasures are clean but repetitive. A scribe in Marseille copies the same stock phrase used in Lyon: the estate was found leaderless. A cleric in Naples notes that no record survives of the master's successor, mirroring an identical sentence written months earlier in Tours. The handwriting changes, the language shifts, but the story remains the same. When independent records mirror each other without coordination, something is at work beneath them, something unspoken, possibly unrecorded. It could be fear, it could be policy, or it could be something both older and more insidious, an agreement. Some scholars whisper of an unspoken pact, never signed, never declared, but tacitly understood across the powerful. Let the men vanish. Let their names dissolve into dust. Let the order fall with just enough noise to satisfy justice, but not enough to fracture the foundation of the church. Not enough to expose the debts, the secrets, the alliances that had once protected them. In this way, the pattern becomes a map, not of roads or places, but of absences. A geography of silence stretching from the Rhone Valley to the hills of Castile, from the Vatican archives to the northern shores of Cyprus, where the same stories end too soon, where the same men are not named, where history, as if tired of remembering gently, turns the page. If the scattered clues, silences, and vanishing figures whisper one thing consistently, it is this: what happened to the missing Templar leaders was not chaos. It was choreography. Not clumsy erasure, but precise removal. And not only tolerated by the powers of the day, but quietly, expertly arranged. This wasn't the first time institutions had rearranged their truths, but it may be among the few historical moments where an entire class of senior religious military officials, men with names, properties, duties, disappeared in unison across multiple kingdoms without revolt, inquiry, or long-term documentation. Too many regions lost the same kind of men. Too many trial records omit exactly those who held the greatest authority. Too many testimonies avoid precisely the questions that would have illuminated the hierarchy's final hours. And the strongest suggestion that everyone involved seemed to understand: it was better not to ask. The church, eager to distance itself from accusations of political maneuvering, likely had little appetite to air every internal inconsistency. The French crown, having gained lands and silenced debts, had no interest in relitigating missing persons. Other monarchs preferred the outcome as cleanly as possible, especially if former Templars had been quietly reassigned, integrated, or allowed to fade into monastic life under new names. Even the papal bulls announcing the suppression of the Order Vox in excelso and ad providam are curiously broad. They condemn the institution, but remain vague on individual guilt beyond the top leadership. Jacques de Molay and a few others are addressed by name. The rest lumped together as brothers of the temple, with no distinctions drawn between the guilty, the silent, or the missing. That vagueness may have been intentional. A blanket condemnation allows for selective enforcement. Those who were politically valuable could be shielded. Those who were too dangerous could be disappeared. And those who simply knew too much could be placed under indefinite spiritual custody, never quite imprisoned, never quite free. What we see in retrospect is not a cover-up in the modern sense. It's something more sophisticated, more medieval. A shared understanding among institutions that too many truths would rupture the fragile harmony between church crown and public faith. So they didn't lie, they simply didn't name. They permitted the narrative to form without supplying the final details. And in doing so, they created a mystery so complete, it became invisible. This is why the commanderies were left leaderless without comment. Why letters refer to orders that no longer exist. Why clerks refer to men of the past order in phrases that deflect rather than describe. It's why so many records stop mid-thought, mid-name, mid-line. When patterns emerge with this kind of repetition, they're rarely random. They're designed. The Templar leaders who vanished did not all flee. Some may have. Some were likely executed in secret. Others may have taken on new identities, settled into quiet exile, or been held under silent house arrest by friendly prelates. But wherever they ended up, the one thing they shared was absence, a disappearance, not only from the world, but from history's official voice. It is the perfect vanishing act, not because no one noticed, but because everyone chose to pretend it was already explained. And as the centuries passed, their erasure became normal, unquestioned. Just one more forgotten chapter in a book that was never truly read aloud. The question isn't whether they disappeared, it's how many people helped them do it. When a name disappears, so does a story. When enough names vanish, history itself becomes unsteady, like a cathedral built on air. The silent removal of key Templar leaders was not only a loss of people, it was the quiet detonation of an entire memory structure. The legacy of the Knights of the Temple was not just changed by fire and verdict, it was rewritten by absence. In the centuries that followed, the void left behind gave birth to myth. With no clear records, no definitive ends for these men, imagination rushed in to fill the gaps. That is how whispers of hidden treasure, secret lineages, and lost rituals took root. In the vacuum created by controlled disappearance, folklore became archive. Legends became placeholders for truths that had been intentionally dismantled. But history suffers when it is fed silence. The Church's inability or unwillingness to account for these disappearances cast a long shadow over its own credibility. Even now, with modern historians combing through Vatican archives and royal ledgers, the unanswered questions remain. The clean erasure of certain Templars stands out precisely because the medieval world was not good at being tidy. Chaos was its native tongue. So when a silence is this consistent, it tells its own tale. What was lost isn't only data, it's perspective. We don't know how these men would have defended the order, what explanations they might have given for the rituals, what political games they could have exposed. Without their voices, the trial of the Templars becomes a theater of selected players with key witnesses kept off stage. And so we inherit a verdict shaped more by who was missing than by who was heard. Even modern scholarship still struggles under this weight. Researchers debate not just what happened, but why we don't know what happened. That's the deeper injury. The mystery isn't the only thing that lingers. It's the uncertainty about the mechanisms of that mystery. Who had the power to erase? Who agreed to keep the silence? How many truths were lost not to flames, but to bureaucratic shrugs and shared understanding? The Templar myth in all its grandness began here not with swords or grails, but with a pen, a ledger, and a missing name. And now, as we finally allow ourselves to examine the cracks in the record, we begin to recover not just facts, but the nature of how facts were made and unmade. In the end, maybe that's the most lasting legacy of these vanished leaders. They remind us that history isn't just what was written. It's also what was carefully, exquisitely erased. Let the silence now rest. Let the names return in shadows, if not in ink. Let the truth, however faint, breathe again.